Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, as per whatever geography you're based out of. This is Malvi. I represent Zycus, and today all we have gathered for a 1-hour webinar session on the topic, Getting Internet of Things Ready for Procurement, the IoT. So before we start, I will quickly go through why we are here and what we are going to do here. And I hope you guys have no problem in joining and dialing in. In case you have any questions, we will be taking it towards the end. So let me just introduce Zycus and our panelists, and I think we should be good to start after that. So I will be the moderator for today's session. This session we are doing in collaboration with John Hansen, Mark Hubbard, and Robert Hansfield. I will be telling a little more brief about them as we go deeper down the session. Before we start, a few housekeeping tips for you all. At any point of time, you may send us your questions in the question and answer box, and they will be addressed towards the end of the webinar. We will have certain polls as well, which will be open from time to time, and you all will get 1 minute to answer those questions. All right. Now, a little bit about Zycus. Zycus is a leading global provider of complete source-to-pay suite of procurement performance solutions. Our comprehensive product portfolio includes applications for both the strategic and operation aspects of procurement. As you can see from the diagram, we can show you what we cover the whole S2P cycle, and we have dedicated solutions catering towards specific needs of S2P cycle. With immense pride, I would like to tell we have been named as the leaders in the Gartner Magical Quadrant right for the last 3 years in 2013, 15, and 17. You can see from the chart a little bit. You can see what all are our expertise, where we have been ranked by Gartner in the Magic Quadrant for strategic sourcing application suite services. A little bit about our speakers first. First of all, I would like to introduce Robert Hansfield. Robert is Executive Director of the Supply Chain Resource Corporation. You can see the whole bio over here. I will just tell you a little brief. Robert is the Bank of America University Distinguished Professor of Supply Chain Management. He has numerous articles, and he has worked in different agencies and different companies throughout his life. Having him here gives us a little of more confidence that he will be able to project us how IoT, which is a buzzword these days, is going to transform our lives, specifically in the procurement domain. Our second panelist is Mark Hubbard. Mark is currently Managing Director at Smart Brown Dog Limited. Mark is an experienced management consultant and trainer in the field of chain management, strategic purchasing, sourcing, supply chain management. He was previously working with Positive Purchasing right from 2013 till very recently, and now he has been a managing director at Smart Brown Dog Limited. Mark is, of course, a thought leader and has experience in several areas of procurement practices, including our one topic today, IoT. And lastly, but not least, we have John Hansen. John is from Procurement Insights as the editor and lead writer for the Procurement Insights blog, which has more than 25,000 followers. John has written more than 3,000 articles and papers, as well as numerous books and numerous articles and papers, as well as 5 books on subjects as diverse as supply chain practice, public or policy, emerging business trends, and social media. In addition to being a much sought-after speaker and moderator internationally, John is also the host of highly acclaimed PI winner on the World Show on Blog Talk Radio, which has aired more than 800 episodes since its initial broadcast in 2019. Saying all these things, I would like to again invite all of you to this engaging session. I'm hopeful that today we'll be having a very engaging and discursive engagement. So without wasting no other time, let me just present you today's webinar, and John, thank you for being with us, and it's over to you.
Thank you, Malvi. Well, listen, it's great to be here, and again, to share these virtual webinar waves with both Mark and Rob. Welcome to both of you. Now, I want to just say a couple of things before we get into this. Following the session today, we're going to be activating what's known as a tweet chat. Now, if you're not familiar with that, all you do is go on Twitter and type in that hashtag with the little lines in front, IoT Edge. And starting about 20 minutes at the conclusion of the webinar and ongoing for days, if not weeks afterwards, we'll be posting excerpts from the conversation today, the polling results. I'll get into those in a moment, by the way, as well as inviting those other industry thought leaders and experts to join us and share their thoughts on the Internet of Things. So I want you to be aware that beyond the webinar itself, the discussion will indeed continue. Now, one more thing I want to stress is throughout this entire presentation, we want you to be an active participant in the dialogue. And what that means is, as we talk, as we share our insights and our thoughts relative to where IoT is going and the impact it will have on the procurement world, if you have questions right then and there, and we're going to ask you for a few questions, please respond and provide your questions in the space provided, and we'll get to you right then and there. So you don't have to wait until the end of the event or the webinar to ask questions. We want you an intricate part of this entire exchange, and again, it's very much interactive. We will be posting polls, live polls that you can respond to as we introduce each section. So again, we want you to be part of the dialogue itself. Now, looking at today's agenda, which is focusing on three particular areas. And it's quite simple. What is the Internet of Things? You know, we all talk about it, we hear it, artificial intelligence, all of this. What does it mean? What does it actually involve? And I must tell you that it extends well beyond just the technology, as you'll find out from today's session. We're looking into how IoT is driving change in procurement. Now, you may have ideas as to how that is occurring now. Well, I can assure you that this goes a little bit beyond that and maybe goes into areas that you may not have suspected were a part of this overall equation. And finally, how do you as a procurement professional become IoT ready? Now, without further delay, I want to turn over to both Mark and Rob Hanfield as we go into our first survey, which is from a procurement standpoint. Is IoT a benefit, a threat, just another technological event, or other? So, Malvi, if you could cue the survey or the poll, and I'll start first of all with you, Rob. You know, when you talk about IoT, is it actually a benefit or a threat, or how do you view IoT to the procurement world? Hello, Mark?
I'm sorry, it's Rob.
Rob, sorry about that.
For a moment. Yeah, no problem. So, yes, I really view it as, believe it or not, another technological event. I don't think people really know how to use data, and IoT is data that is collected from sensors embedded in machines and in objects. I don't think people are really thinking yet how to use the data. I think there's sensors out there that are collecting data, but I don't see anyone really thinking about it as a benefit or threat yet. I think it's still in a nation stage where they're really trying to figure out how to use all this data, which, you know, is coming along with all of this other data from other places as well.
So we're just very, very early into this process, so really no one has a chance to really form an opinion based upon what we know about it now, is really what you're saying, right, Rob?
That's correct. That's correct. You know, I think a lot of people do worry that it's a threat, but I think the reports on it being used to spy on us and so forth, you know, it's still a lot of mythology, in my opinion.
Okay, well, Mark, let's turn it over to you in here. Is it a real thing? Are we talking about what Rob said is that, quite frankly, we don't know enough about it to reach any kind of conclusion regarding its viability going forward? It's sort of more sizzle than substance. What do you think, Mark?
I think Mark's on mute as well.
Oh, hopefully he can get off mute there.
Yeah, sorry guys. Just to be slightly controversial, I think it's a benefit, but not in the concept of a describable benefit, because Robert's absolutely right. It's undefined exactly what this thing will become or where the killer applications will be. but it's actually a benefit because it's making us have discussions about knowledge within the procurement space, how analysis works, what sort of information we might need, which is an ongoing discussion anyway, but it's adding another strand of thought process into that discussion, which hopefully will drive us into a better place on knowledge management and knowledge development out of the various bits of data that are available to us at the moment, and how we want to extend that. So that's why I think it's a benefit, just because it creates the discussion as much as anything else. And there will be other benefits that might come out later.
Well, now you see it's kind of interesting because the general poll result is 61% feel it's a benefit. The next would agree with Rob, saying that it's just another technological event. So I'm going to pose this question to the audience. For those who said it's a benefit, how is it a benefit, or how do you perceive it as being a benefit? And again, I want to encourage you to use the Q&A section here so that you can pose your thoughts or share. That you can do it as well. Wait a second, there's a couple of people here. I see that they're trying to hear something. Malvi, I'll leave that into your hands to be able to get that technological element straightened out. But look, those in the audience, when you said it's a benefit, how do you see it as being a benefit? And those who see it as just being another technological event, in what way do you see it? Because I guess, Mark, Rob, one of the things I think about when I look at your particular response is that, you know, over the years, procurement has been basically, I mean, the industry and the profession has changed somewhat, but there's been new technologies entered all the time into the equation. You know, you look at the advent of the fax machine, I'm sure that had an impact. You look at the introduction of the computer and the personal computer, all of these things. I mean, Rob, do you consider it to be basically that the procurement profession or the function of procurement remains relatively constant with some modifications, obviously, and eyes on improvement, but do you feel that, generally speaking, technology happens external to it and it's just another ability to adapt to it, much like we did the fax machine and the PC?
Absolutely, John, and that's really the core of you know, the argument that we use in my book on the living supply chain is, you know, organizations have to learn how to adapt to exploit all this data and use it to their advantage. And certainly in procurement, you know, it's wonderful to have machines that have sensors in them, but until you can integrate that data into a decision-making format, until you think about the governance around how that data is used, who gets to see it, how it's pulled together, then I don't think it becomes a true benefit. People, you know, you look at the smart grid today, for instance, in energy. There's all these homes that have these sensors broadcasting data. We don't really, utility companies still don't really know how to use that information. There are some instances, for instance, companies like Caterpillar and John Deere are embedding sensors in their equipment, and they foresee being able to use that data to be able to sort of predict when and where that information or those vehicles can be worked on. You know, and a great example is that you have a farmer in a field. They have a week to get their crop out. The equipment is stuck in the field. It breaks down. That sensor would send a signal to the dealer and back to the manufacturing site that we need a part for that product, and we need to get there within 24 hours. So that's the kind of application I could foresee the Internet of Things being able to facilitate in industry, but we're not quite there yet.
Well, you know, here's an interesting thought. I want to take it, there's a couple of comments that have come in. Terry mentioned it's a benefit because of the ability to streamline, develop end-to-end processes. But that also poses a threat, according to Terry, because it will replace the simple buying tasks, and the function needs to develop the relationship side or die. So, you know, and I'm going to take your thoughts there, because one of the things that you're saying, Rob, is the sensors being able to automatically trigger a buy to get a replacement part in. Going with that thought to you, Mark, and what Terry had just said, I mean, this is one of the benefits, though, that capability. But does that not pose a threat to the people who are just regular buyers. And I'm going to digress a little, Mark. Just one thing. CPO Agenda had a roundtable discussion a number of years ago that still has a lot of the elements holding true today, where senior executives said we'd rather have one strategic procurement professional than 10 everyday buyers. I mean, if you're going to look at it as a threat and look at this automation that Rob has referred to, you know, what does that say for the profession? I mean, do we have to evolve to a certain degree? And to what degree do we have to?
Well, interestingly, for every technological change that's come in, there's been a need for some form of procurement evolution. As I guess that progression from a administrative role through to a value-adding strategic function is one that is still underway at the moment. So we're bound to see elements of change as some aspects of the things that we do become more automated, but there's still elements that will always exist in the background area. And as we know, a lot of the challenge in procurement isn't as much to do with the technology or the processing aspects. It's actually to do with the interfaces that we have within the organization and with suppliers, which still need tending and care just as they always have done. So those elements will continue to be not Internet of Things because we still need to talk to people, unless we all become embedded with chips that process our thoughts. But I feel that's a little distance off.
Well, and you see, that goes to the heart of what I guess what Terry was saying, relationship, develop the relationship side or die. So the Internet of Things free you up to focus on those more strategic functions. Now what's interesting is Denisha said that the Internet of Things is a technological event. However, currently procurement's approach exists in different forms without an end-to-end solution. But it goes on to write, as we hear about blockchain and cloud procurement and source-to-pay, technology is at the forefront. So would you say Denisha has the right handle on it in that there's the recognition that technology is at the forefront, but tying into what you said, Mark, and certainly what Terry had alluded to, is it still doesn't replace the key essential elements. What it does is maybe it lessens us of those more, and I'll use the word mundane or everyday tasks, so that we are free to become strategic. I mean, is that the best way to look at the Internet of Things and AI and all these emerging technologies?
I think that's absolutely right. If you use a slightly historical example, then many businesses have invested significant amount of money in SAP and Oracle systems with the promise of great data analysis, and some of those areas have changed activities that we undertake. But the problem we've still got is trying to get high quality knowledge out of that to influence the decision making that we're going to undertake. So Internet of Things for me is like the next phase of some of that development, where we will get better information, better raw data out. And if we're really good at acquiring AI and analytics, then we'll get better at developing knowledge. But that's just about extending the promise of what's actually there. I still believe firmly that procurement people have a massive ability to impact that by getting good at some of those key areas of data analysis and knowledge gathering, and IoT will be an input into that.
Now, you see, now this brings us sort of full back to you, Rob, and I just want to say this, sorry to interrupt, but Pushkar said, that being said, it will definitely ease some of the processes, and that's proved beneficial, but it won't change procurement. Has a function at its core. And I think that's what you're saying, Rob, is that technology it streamlines certain elements, but at its heart, it's another technological event simply because, and there'll be another technological event maybe 10 years from now, simply because at its heart, procurement as a function doesn't necessarily change. I mean, and that's what you were saying, right, Rob?
Exactly. I kind of see that, Internet of Things is going to be used in conjunction with other critical technologies. And if you think about it, it's really the convergence of technologies that creates, truly innovative ways of working. You think about the iPhone. The iPhone was convergence of, 3D, as well as digital photography and digital music. It was really these different technologies that came together in the iPhone. And I think we're going to see Internet of Things converging with cognitive computing, with cloud-based, with big data and statistical analysis. And in my mind, what this will mean was that there's all this data coming in, and a critical skill that future generations of purchasing managers will need to embrace is the ability to interact with these cognitive learning systems. You know, with all this data coming in, computers will be able to take the data and process it very quickly. But individuals will need to understand, you know, how do we ask questions of the data? How do we query it? How do we make decisions based on multiple signals? And what are the key metrics that we need to be involved in? So it's that ability of the dynamic workforce to embrace this complexity and be able to quickly learn how to interact with machines. So humans will still very much be in the loop, but it will be a very different role from what we've seen in the past.
Well, you know, I think that's kind of what Michael was alluding to in his comment, and then we'll move on, is that a lot of what I hear is around automation and not specific to IoT. And that sort of supports, Rob, what you're saying to a certain degree, that it's a technological event with benefits. So, and just one more, IT sourcing side includes sufficient data, and Tanya raised as many of the things we had talked about, remotely monitor SLAs and KPIs. So I think it's safe to say that, you know, while it's a benefit, I think it falls both Mark and Rob, both of you being right in your assessment, is it's a technological event that has a benefit. I think that's the best way we can move on. But here's an interesting point, and I want to touch on this with the next slide and get your take on this. According to a Wall Street Journal 2017 survey, so this is actual current information. 87% response said that talent drives procurement performance. However, there is still 62%, a large to moderate skill gap across analytical abilities, and that 60% of CPOs believe that their teams lack the necessary skills to deliver their procurement strategy. So I got to go back to this. I'm going to start with you, Mark, and then go Rob. I mean, is this skills gap associated because of IoT, or is this something that has existed all along? And the reason I ask this question, Mark, is that as we get into the IoT world and artificial intelligence, will that not make this even worse of a result? Because now not only do we have the lack of skills within our own capabilities prior to digital transformation, but wouldn't the introduction of new technologies this exacerbate that gap further? What do you think when you see something like this?
Yeah, I mean, it's a challenge that I spend a lot of time working on training in procurement organizations, and the challenge of the skills and knowledge gap is noticeable, just because I think there's a gap between how procurement organizations and individuals can think of themselves and the skills that we're needing to adopt as we move forward. And just to use a stupid example, or perhaps a very relevant one, when we had the surge of activity in the use of e-auctions in certain areas of purchasing, then there's clearly a degree of skill that is necessary there to use that technology effectively. But most organizations have a very limited pool of people who have fully grasped the skill levels and the activities that are necessary to run them most effectively. And that's been happening over, what, 8 or 10 years now. And it's still only moving forward relatively slowly. So there is a gap there, which isn't an issue for the individual. Well, it is an issue for the individuals, but it's not the fault of the individuals who are engaged in that. It's often a consequence of the pressure that is placed by the same CPOs on delivering short-term savings goals because of internal business pressures. So we can see that sort of short-termism view actually causing a problem in the development of the longer-term skills that we actually need to get hold of.
Now, and Rob, I'm going to pose this to you, but to you in the audience, do these statistics surprise you? I mean, you're on the front lines, you're involved with this, and the fact is that while I mean, 62% is still a large to moderate skills gap. How do you explain that? What is your perception, audience, in that figure? I mean, does it surprise you? Do you agree with it? Do you disagree with it? And Rob, while we're waiting for the audience to respond, within the context of this survey and what Mark just said, is IoT more of a distraction? I mean, like, does it, you know, when you go into this kind of a situation and this environment, I mean, is it more of a distraction than a benefit in this regard?
Well, you know, it's a great question, John, and let me preface my answer with a quote. You know, Albert Einstein said, if someone asked me to come up with the answer to the world's problems in an hour, I'd spend the first 55 minutes coming up with the right question. And you know, I heard this quote, and I think it really characterizes exactly that people need to understand that particularly in procurement, what is the question you're trying to answer? You know, and identifying the critical business issue, because I think what we'll see in the future is that IoT will be a data stream along with other streams of data coming together to create these massive data platforms. And these data platforms will sort of wrap themselves around the individual, and the individual will have to figure out how to interact with the system, how to create cohort mapping systems, how to ask the right questions that can lead to the right answers that they need to make. And I think, you know, there's kind of many procurement managers today, you know, when confronted with this, are kind of frozen. They're not sure how to go about even interacting with these kinds of machines. And, you know, to be honest, the only way that they're going to develop these skills is literally by throwing themselves, you know, into that environment and learning as they go through experimentation, through pilots. And in my mind, I think that's where many organizations are hesitant to move forward, because they're not willing to, you know, to really move forward and pilot these new technologies, which is how you learn.
Well, and, you know, it's a kind of interesting thing, as we know, because this sort of leads into is, you know, when you have technology improvements in technology enabling automation, they're saying the skills of the past will not deliver the needs of the future, and look to attract the next generation of procurement leaders who are innovator challengers and digitally minded thinkers. So I have to raise the question what both you gentlemen said, and again, audience, I want to be able to encourage you to share your thoughts on this supposed talent gap and whether or not, again, IoT is a distraction in this area. But Mark, going back to you, they're putting technology, meaning that the skills of the past won't meet those requirements. But obviously, as you look ahead to these things, if you don't have those skills that Rob was alluding to, I mean, how can you move forward with technology? Or is technology an impetus behind creating more innovative thinking and better ways of doing things? So in other words, as we improve ways of operating, as we streamline ways of operating, we won't need to have that much of a catch-up with that gap, because we'll be doing things differently. Do you know what I'm saying, Mark?
Yeah. There's a certain challenge here in understanding what drives these types of changes in organizations and what becomes the enablers of it. So I guess there's a series of different ways in which new technology is adapted and adopted in organizations successfully. So it tends to be individual enthusiasms, either through individuals in the organization or at a management level. And if those enthusiasms happen, then there is more likely to be an adoption of that change. And that's true of any type of change, whether it's technology or behavior.
Well, you know, if I could interrupt, Mark, because this adds a dimension on what you just said. I want to make what you just said was a very important point. Denisha said there's no surprise that procurement has a lack of analytic skills and their ability to move quick to adopt technologies due to limited knowledge on how to move forward and working independently versus as a group within a company. And I think that leads in a little bit to what you were saying there, is that, again, you need to, and Rob, I think you mentioned as well, you need to have some direction in terms of, and some investment by the organization to help pave the way or facilitate that kind of closure of the skills gap. I mean, that's what you're saying to a certain degree, isn't it, Mark?
Yeah, exactly. It's got to be championed. It's got to be led forward with a degree of solid understanding of what the aims and goals are for an organization to move forward. So without that clarity, without that knowledge of or leadership of what might be possible and what the aims and goals are, changes are really difficult to create in larger organizations. Oh, it's pretty hard in small organizations, but certainly larger ones have got a real turning the super tanker sort of feel to them as we try and get different approaches to be adopted. And part of the IoT challenge is, as we've discussed before, because it's unclear what the killer app is in terms of IoT or quite what it will mean in a number of different areas, the ability to actually lead that change and explore it appropriately is generally missing at the moment because of that lack of definition.
Well, now you see, this is an interesting thing. It kind of goes towards what Pushkar was saying in two comments in this particular discussion stream, is that while it's true, there has to be standardization in the industry, and looking, unless there is a standard that people follow, which gives them complete, accurate information regarding their processes, there will remain the gap. So does this tie back into corporate responsibility, Rob? Like 90%, and we'll go back to this Wall Street Journal survey, 90% of global respondents said that they believe their industries will be disrupted by digital, but only 44% are adequately preparing for it. So doesn't that seem to be, I'm a little confused by that, simply because if you know something's coming, why is there the lack of preparation at the corporate level? And if the corporate level isn't providing leadership in this regard, much to what Mark said, I mean, where will that leave us with this digital transformation we're facing now, Rob?
Well, that's a great question, and I think in my mind it starts with data governance and really thinking about governance mechanism for analytical learning in organizations. We polled people and we asked them, well, who does data analytics or who's responsible for organizing your analytics function? And they said, oh, it's IT. Well, IT really, they're too busy doing multiple other things. So I think within procurement, we're seeing that there are really these IT functions within procurement that need to start building these governance councils that will start really identifying pilots, approving funds for it, and beginning to sort of drive different projects. At the core of it as well, in my mind, I think this goes well with one of the comments that someone made earlier, is data governance. Until you can trust your data, if you don't trust your data, and if the data is flawed, if it isn't quality, if it isn't consistent, isn't timely, you're not going to trust it. So, you've got all these wonderful mechanisms for collecting data, but if it's all kind of garbage by the time it's interacted and mixed together, you're not going to trust it. And in my mind, data governance is a key part of how organizations can get started on this today, by cleansing their data, by ensuring the validity of the data and that it's entered in correctly, and starting to build that foundation for the future analytical digital approach that we're moving towards.
Okay, now this is an interesting thing, and by the way, I want to digress. Kwame said that they can't see the other participants and only the speaker's name, so in terms of the technical issue, I will throw that over to you. But along your thoughts of governance, and Mark talking about what you had, what surprised me in the Wall Street study is that there is virtually no training investment in helping to bring up the procurement professionals to a higher level of understanding, if that's the way to say it. In fact, less than 1% of budget is spent on training. So if it's safe to say in all of these things, because we do have to move along to the next section, I mean, I could talk to you gentlemen all day about this, but is it safe to say that given all of I'll call it hype around IoT and artificial intelligence, if you don't have the foundation of a clear direction and helping your employees and educating them not only on governance but training and improving the indigenous, I guess that's the best way to put it, functions and requirements of the procurement profession itself, we're not going to really get to the stage of being able to leverage to its full advantage IoT, and that perhaps maybe all of us are putting a little bit more stock into well, once IoT comes, it'll fix all of those other problems, and we'll end up on the other side of it, right back to where we belong again. I mean, is that a fair way to sum it up in just 30 seconds, Mark, and then I'll go to you, Rob?
Yeah, the need to understand the requirements as applied to procurement, as Terry says, is fundamental, because that then drives a cycle of behaviour that we need to get hold of.
All right, Rob, again, going back to what you had said at the very beginning with the first poll results, it's a technological event, but without the governance, without the training, without the education, I mean, we're likely to go through this high-octane level of excitement and end up exactly where we are right now. I mean, is that a fair thing to say, unless we get some proactive involvement at the people level?
Yeah, absolutely, John. And I think, you know, by proactive involvement, specifically in training, you know, I think the training issue has to be, you have to train people how to use machines, but you also have to, you know, in a cognitive environment, have to train machines how to work with people. And, you know, as I said earlier, being able to understand how to interact with machines, how to ask the right questions is key, because today we already have too much data. And you throw IoT on top of it, now you're going to have streaming data. It's also important to understand that, you know, IoT is really, another word for it is called distributed computing. And what we mean by that is there will be machines that will collect the sensor data and summarize it and you know, connect it back to other pools of data into either a data mart or a data warehouse, or increasingly calling it a data lake. So now we have IoT data in this data lake with all of this other data from, you know, from our SAP system, from our EDI systems, from everything else. And, you know, we have to be able to understand what is the business issue we're trying to solve. And what is the business issue, and what is the business question that we're trying to solve. And that's when we can start to say, oh, well, we have this IoT data, we're pulling from our machines or from our products or what have you, and that can help us with this business problem that we're trying to solve if we track it and we use it in combination with other data. And again, we have to be able to go back and say, well, what is the problem, what is the hypothesis, and then what are the systems that we need to collect data that can help us answer that in real time.
So realistically, very simply put, it's like a high-powered advanced car, but there's no gas to run it. It looks good and you've got the capability, but you can't really take it anywhere. I guess that would be the simplistic, overly simplistic way of putting it. Okay, well, so let's go to our second poll.
Let me put it another way.
Okay.
Let me put it another way, too. Like on your car, you don't need to have the information on the exact oil pressure. You know, you don't need to know what the RPMs is, you know, for each wheel individually. You know, you need to know when there's a problem. You need to know when there's an issue. You only need to pull that information when you need it. But in most cases, you don't need it on an everyday basis. But when you need it, you really need it.
Got it. Good way to close off. Let's go to the second poll. In what areas will IoT have the greatest impact on procurement? Based upon and in the context of what we've just discussed, what is IoT? Will it be on empowering companies to gain greater and more timely visibility into their spend, cost savings? Will it enable organizations, and this maybe goes along the lines of your example, Rob, tracking and monitoring the movement of goods within supply chains, streamlining supplier engagement, which is kind of interesting going back to what Terry had said in the comment, is that we still need to build those relationships, or areas. So we're going to activate this poll minute to be able to respond to this. So I'm going to start with you this time, Mark. In terms of the response here, what do you think it's likely to encompass when we look at the fact that IoT eventually, whether it has it immediately or in the future, where will it have the greatest impact on procurement, in your opinion?
Yeah, strangely, I'm going to go for other, and I'll tell you why. I think the largest challenge for procurement is actually going to be in defining the way we interact and utilize the technologies are there in one aspect. But the second aspect will be working to secure the purchase of the IoT mechanisms or machines that are going to be most useful for our organization in a time at which a lot of the technology is still at the early adopter stage, to put it mildly. There's a lot of businesses out there providing stuff that is not fully developed, is in early stage of adoption, and there's a great risk of organizations having buyer's remorse for chasing after the wrong type of technology or asking the wrong question, to go back to Robert's point, to actually answering the wrong question about IoT on the way through. So interestingly, I think there's actually going to be genuine procurement issues, both in working out what it is we want to do, but also managing the process for our businesses of what it is we're buying, which are satisfying IoT needs. Well,
now, Rob, before I hand this over to you, and this is an interesting thought here. One of the things you talked about is, remember the monitoring system that would tell you that a part is needed, for example, in terms of when it breaks down, we get a notification there's a part, then we can respond to it. One of the things that I thought immediately was tracking and monitoring the movement of goods within supply chains is something where IoT can have an immediate effect that is almost external, though, to the procurement process itself, correct? I mean, what are your thoughts in terms of this?
Yeah, I think tracking and monitoring the movement of goods is certainly an application that we're seeing a lot of organizations come up with that. A new startup called Teeve, I met with, are doing some things there. In my mind, I think that the first application, however, is still going to be around quality and preventive maintenance. There's one example I can think of, a large computer company that manufactured servers. They have monitors in the servers that send signals back to their maintenance group. And when they detect a problem through these pings that come in every minute, they can actually see what parts are about to fail. And they can, let procurement know, and they'll get the part, and they'll go in and they'll replace the part so the server doesn't go down. In one case, they've taken that data, they've actually created analytics around it to be able to say in what situations, based on predictive analytics, should we actually go in and replace the server entirely, based on those signals, those IoT pings that they're getting. So, and I think that kind of an application is really unique. And I think increasingly we're going to see, IoT being used to prevent problems, to prevent customer disruptions, to prevent issues from happening in the supply chain because of the predictive analytics that can be used when we start using this data to predict when and where problems will occur. That goes for preventive maintenance as opposed to, regular maintenance kinds of things, and in large equipment. So I think that's where the real money initially is going to be with the application of IoT.
See, now, it's kind of interesting. The responses are interesting. I'm going to post this back to the audience afterwards. But the audience responses seem to align with what both of you gentlemen are saying at the same time. With regard to you, Rob, and my take on it, 16% said tracking and monitoring would be the obvious benefit, followed by empowering companies. But here's something that's interesting. 58% had no answer. Now, I'm not sure they didn't respond, but basically there was no answer in terms of what IoT does. So I'm going to go back to the audience, and I'm going to say to you, why did you have no answer? Is it that you're trying to get a handle on it? And remember, by the way, I want to assure everybody, there's no right or wrong answer here. This isn't a test, so you won't be getting marks on it. But having no answer, that sort of goes to your other area, Mark, where you were saying, is it because there just isn't a firm understanding as to where it fits in, and there has to be more involvement in terms of what it actually means along the lines of what you're talking about? I mean, does this result surprise you, Mark?
No, I think we're actually sufficiently early on in getting a better understanding of IoT that feels right. We can't be sure about where the greatest impact is because IoT is still relatively undefined. There's some areas, as Robert was describing, there's some areas that are starting to come out. But it's a very broad brush, IoT is a very broad brush description for a wide range of possible data sources and interactions and how we might be able to use those. So it is awkward to try and get a grip on exactly what will happen. The interesting bit for me is that I think and Robert's alluded to this before, is the background piece of how we get better at the data analysis and the development of knowledge from the data that's available to us will actually become one of the more cohesive things that will tie elements of IoT together. So it won't be about buying IoT-enabled kit. It will be about buying extremely well-developed AI-based, probably data analysis techniques and mechanisms to present that. That whole data analytics and how to get insight from it is a regular discussion with lots of our clients on how you get to decision-making processes on the back of random data that is currently available, and that's a real real challenge. And until we get good at that bit, it won't even be clear, I suspect, which bits of IoT are most useful.
Well, now you see that goes by with what Rodrigo had said, is there's no answer other. Not sure procurement is directly impacted by IoT. Impact can work with different departments, but procurement can get or bring that innovation into different depths. So I think there's a general. I think the audience is intuitively in sync with what both of you gentlemen are saying. Let's move on, because I think we're going to be running a little tight of time here. Now I'm having a little bit of problem moving the screen forward, so Malvi, I'm running into a little bit of technical difficulties here. There we go. All right, so we moved ahead. Let me make sure I didn't miss anything back here. All right, so CPOs report that the deployment of automation and robotics within their function will steadily increase. Again, there's that, it's going to come. Currently, 50% of respondents say that their procurement teams make some use of these technologies, but 93% expect to do so by 2025. So I'm going to throw this back here again in terms of this. If you look at this, 50% are using it, yet according to the audience, they have no answer as to how IoT will affect them. But 50% say they're using these new technologies. Is that a verification of what you were saying, Mark, and even yourself, Rob, and Rodrigo were saying, well, it's out there and it's obviously being used, but it's certainly not extended to include the procurement world. And if that's the case, when 93% expect to utilize the digital disruption or to be affected by digital by 2025, how much of it is really going to impact procurement then? Do you know what I'm saying, Rob?
Yeah, exactly. And that's, I think, another argument for why, procurement supply chain need to really start working on their own and creating, creating their own center of excellence or program manager or what have you, because this isn't something where you just, turn on a button and all of a sudden you have IoT, right? This is really a learning of how do we use this information. And let's experiment with it, and then let's do pilots. And in my mind, I think organizations are not moving fast enough. And what's interesting for me is that, you start looking at least in the U.S. here, you have these huge, tax windfalls coming in. There's a huge amount of cash on balance sheets, and keeping cash on balance sheets is really a poor use of capital. So I think organizations need to start investing, building these core teams of individuals who have the time, the motivation to work on these new digital products, explore the art of the possible, creatively test these new technologies. And in the process, not all of these are going to succeed. In fact, most of them will probably fail, but it's the learning that occurs as organizations start experimenting with it and learn what works and what doesn't work. And it's much more of a sort of an R&D culture, I think, that needs to be created in the procurement function, where you're trying new things and you're experimenting. That's the way we're going to have progress, in my mind.
Okay, Mark, and adding on to that, because as I look at this, again, 3/4 of respondents, and these are CPOs responding in a Deloitte survey, which is also from 2017, so it's relatively new. When I see this, I think IoT and procurement, wishful thinking. What do you think, Mark?
If you, this is just to give a sense of it, in the previous slide you were talking about 95% expect there to be broad use in 2025, 7 years time. 7 years ago, the iPhone 3GS was introduced, the first sort of slightly faster version. In 7 years time, the development of the technology that we're talking about as IoT will have moved beyond our immediate ability to guess where it will go. So there's bound to be far more definition, far more interaction that's available to us by then. So we're going to see that move in that direction just because of the pace of change in technology and the way in which new activities, new data analysis, new AI technologies will become available, and it's going to move there. So to some extent, we're going to have to get to grips with the speed of movement that's in there and start to engineer that. But because we're at the earlier phases of it just now, it's hard to imagine exactly which piece it's going to be. One of the challenges we got is if you look around your business and ask who the IoT leader is, the IoT direction setter, the thought leader for a particular organization, let alone in procurement, then who is that individual and where do they think it's going to go? And I suspect that's still at the level of not being fully defined for a lot of organizations. I say that having worked with a...
Sorry to interrupt, but as part of that definition on this next slide, 65% of global CPOs surveyed said that analytics will have the most impact on the function in the next 2 years. And I think Pushkar earlier had said the gap seems to be true for analytics. There has to be some standardization. And Denisha said procurement's lack of analytic skills. So if I'm looking at this, and this is segue into our next survey, the reality is we don't have to be IoT trained as much as we have to become better skilled in the areas that can use IoT, such as the analytics and the big data. I mean, is that a fair thing to say, Mark?
I think that's absolutely right. The discussions that we have on that exact subject are ongoing and almost legendary in the levels of difficulty. There's a book by a guy called David McCandless called Knowledge is Beautiful, which just looks at the challenges of expressively displaying complex data sets in a way that the human minds can actually make sense out of them. And it's a really good thing to go and look at, because if you consider the world that we actually inhabit, which is, I don't know what your guys' world is like, but mine seems to have an awful lot of PowerPoint slides in it, a lot of which suffer from the data problem of people haven't got enough time to do proper analysis, and therefore you end up presented with a huge amount of data which can often be meaningless. And that, for me, is going to be one of the biggest challenges on the back of IoT, is how do we get to grips with this lake of data that Robert was talking about, and how do we actually make sense out of that in a way that can influence decision making appropriately?
Well, now you know what, in what I would consider, based on what you said, and Rob, what you had said earlier, return to the roots. And again, I keep coming back to what you had said at the very beginning, Rob, about, you know, what is IoT? It's another technological event. In the Chief Procurement Survey, again, referring to the Wall Street Journal, 84% of responding CPOs cited cost reduction as their top priority, and this extended to South America, Asia Pacific, Europe, everywhere. So, I mean, as much as things change, they remain the same, don't they, Rob? I mean, the reality is it all comes back to how, and what Mark was just saying, is how we use IoT to better analyze and manage data to get us to our end result, which is a cost reduction. I mean, so is that a safe way to put it, Mark or Rob? Is that realistically speaking, you know, what it all comes down to at the end of the day is something very, very simple. Will it help us to lower costs? I mean, that's really in a nutshell.
Yeah, I think, you know, and I'm glad you brought this up, because I noted this on the survey as well. Yeah, cost will continue to be important. I mean, procurement people, it's sort of, you know, what runs through our veins, if you will. What distinguishes, I think, the application of analytics and IoT and cost reduction is not associated with price reduction. You know, another interesting statistic from ISM is that the average tenure of CPOs is 2.4 years, which means what these guys do is they come in, they chop off, negotiate lower prices, but they don't really address all of the issues around TCO, and then they move on to another role. You know, cost reduction in my mind is a long-term continuous improvement activity, and you use it through looking at your data, developing cost models, understanding areas like productivity, how you can reduce costs in serving the customer, how you can improve delivery and service and quality. That's where you're going to find the money that's being wasted in most of our supply chains today. And I think analytics and IoT can help us identify those costs and find ways to improve performance in collaboration with our suppliers and our service providers. I think they have to be part of the entire ecosystem to really drive those cost savings.
All right. Well, now let's go, and we have about 7 minutes left. By the way, Malvi, sometimes we run a couple minutes over time, so hopefully we'll be able to do that here. But I thought it was very important, gentlemen, that at the very beginning we actually tackle the question of what is IoT, because let's face it, if we don't answer that question, then everything else is just talk, just conversation. Yeah. So going to poll number 3. Which of the following activities demonstrates a high-performance procurement practice? Now, you know, and I'm bringing it back to this simply because that last result showed that, again, we return to our elemental roots of what we know and cost reduction. So which of these in this poll would you say is the most important, audience? I love your feedback. Strategic business and supplier collaboration, M&A to corporate risk planning, and new product service development or other. So I'll start with you, Mark. What are your thoughts on this? Which one do you think is going to be the most important? Because at the end of the day, we want to become a high-performance procurement practice, whether that's through automation or through the improvement of indigenous skills. What are your thoughts?
Because procurement still maintains that position, or should maintain a position as a key interface between the supply chain and the organization, the first definition, strategic business and supply collaboration activities, for me is the area in which we need to continue to develop and focus. The more we can get from our supply chain to align with our strategic business objectives, the better we will perform, not from the perspective of CPOs perhaps, but certainly from the rest of the senior management team, where there is a risk that we are only known as the cost cutters. We actually need to we can provide a lot more benefit than that, is the reality, if we're allowed to.
All right. Rob, what are your thoughts? And by the way, before you have your answer, let me frame with a comment that Jeremy just shared. More than cost improvement, IoT will help to identify and mitigate supplier risk. So that was one of the feedback there in terms of the response. What are your thoughts?
No, I agree with Mark completely, and that was my response also, is that strategic collaboration with suppliers. Most procurement organizations, at least most of the ones I talk to, really don't know how to do that very well. You know, they say that they're collaborating, but, you know, until you're actually, you know, sharing information, sharing data, driving continuous improvement, finding ways to create mutual value, you know, you're not going to really benefit from all of this data that we're surrounding ourselves with. And in my mind, most of the cost improvement opportunities are through supplier suggestions that occur after the contract is signed, not before. And I think that's where we need to focus, is that ongoing cost reduction, continuous improvement through collaboration, where we're going to see the biggest benefits.
Well, everyone would tend to agree with you, and you know this. And I just want to add this in. About a year or so ago, I did an interview with someone talking about the advent of the internet and how we're all more connected than ever before, but we actually communicate with one another less, which seems to be a contradictory statement. But it goes to what both you gentlemen are saying here. No matter how technologically advanced we become, if we don't know how to be strategic and collaborate with our suppliers and our partners, then all the technology in the world isn't going to help us. I mean, is that too extreme of a statement? I mean, or should we take a page out of the internet world in general and again, all the platforms, the LinkedIn's, et cetera, where again, we may have thousands of connections, but how many of them do we really communicate or collaborate with? I mean, is that overly simplified or is too extreme my comment?
I think it's spot on. I really do. I think until we can collaborate, then all the data in the world can solve our problems.
Okay. Well, you know what? We have a few slides, so you know, let me just jump through a couple of things. We've talked about digital disruption. We've talked about, you know, joining the high ranks of performers in capacity and capability is not necessarily an easy thing to do, I want to go to something called directly the 7 capabilities. And what Chief Procurement Officers indicated are the 7 capabilities are executive advocacy, stakeholder alignment, decision-making, talent strategy, talent investment, talent capability, and digital procurement. You notice that digital procurement is on that list, but it isn't the only one. They're looking at all of these other particular areas. And doesn't this, to a certain degree, Mark, come back again, full circle with what we were saying? You know, you talk about a talent strategy and talent investment, yet only 1% of organizations invest in training their people to reach a level of excellence. We talk about stakeholder alignment, and that can be collaboration and communication. But if we don't do that effectively, then what benefit will IoT or artificial intelligence or anything being, perhaps beyond the fact that it'll free us up again from those mundane tasks and give us the chance to be more strategic? But if it does, do we even know how to be strategic, Mark? And let's get into the final comments of tying this in. I'll start with you, Mark, on this to close off, and then go to you, Rob.
Yeah, I think there is a genuine issue there that even if we never touched another purchase order, would we then know what we really need to do to influence stakeholders and get into the right decision-making approach on the way through? And that remains a challenge, no matter how good IoT becomes at feeding us with better and faster data. So that becomes part of the transition process, that not only do we need to see leadership in IoT to help us move in that direction, but we've got to maintain and encourage leadership in areas such as stakeholder alignment, thinking strategically, making sure that procurement's delivering business objectives and not just simple cost cutting.
All right, Rob, your final word with you on all that we have talked about today.
Yeah, I think this is really telling how talent shows up in 3 of the 7 key critical things, yet less than 1% of their budget is spent on training. So, if you want to invest in your supply chain, you have to build and invest in talent. And, another thing, and I'll do a plug here, I think working with universities on projects to learn and explore is a great way to develop talent, both internally and externally. And then also, I think, holding workshops, investing in these programs or centers that are focused on building analytical capabilities, willing to be able to learn through failing. These are all really critical elements of moving forward.
All right. Well, I guess what we're all saying, hopefully everyone, thank you for joining us today. And before I turn it over to Malvi, I guess the thing is, it's your move. And what will you be doing with the information you gain from a webinar such as this and the input, and how do you take it to the next level? Hopefully this will equip you with some additional insight as we prepare for, whether we're ready or not, the digital age upon us. Malvi, I'll turn it over to you now.
All right. Thank you so much, John. It was such an insightful session. Thank you so much, Mark and Robert as well. And I would like to say thanks to all our participants for being so patient and throughout this journey and asking their questions, for making this session so interactive and two-sided, not just we speaking. The last thing, in case you have any questions, you can mail us and we will get back in case we can answer those questions. It was great hosting all of you, and I would look forward, to connecting with all of you in the future. And in case, specifically for my participants, in case you want any of our solutions specifically, any demo session or any demo briefing for us, you can write to us, and we will definitely arrange for one. Thank you so much, people, and have a great day, evening, as per your time zones, and thank you so much. Here's signing off.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers, Robert.